Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into the career of Steve Ballmer.
All right.
You probably know him as that energetic CEO who led Microsoft for 14 years.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack his story, right? From his early days all the way through to his huge influence on the direction Microsoft took and what he's been up to since then.
Right.
Our main source for this is the biography, Steve Ballmer, the energetic CEO who drove Microsoft's expansion and diversification.
Yeah, and it's important to say, I think, going into this that Ballmer's presented in this biography as a complex figure.
Okay.
He was undeniably successful, right? I mean, there's no getting around that. But his legacy is a mix of huge wins and some pretty public missteps as well.
Yeah.
To really understand how all of that played out, I think we kind of have to go back to the beginning.
Yeah, let's talk about his early life then. The bio points out some interesting things that may have kind of hinted at where he'd end up in tech. What do we know about young Steve?
Well, Ballmer was born in 1956, and his dad, Frederick Ballmer, was a manager at Ford Motor Company.
Interesting.
So he kind of grew up around that corporate environment, right? Which probably shaped his understanding of business and leadership from a young age.
Yeah, and he was obviously a very bright kid. A perfect score on the math part of the SATs. That's not easy. Not surprising he ended up at Harvard.
Yeah, and Harvard, of course, is where he crosses paths with Bill Gates. It's funny, they were both involved with the Harvard Crimson, the newspaper, though in different roles. Ballmer, interestingly enough, was also the manager for the football team.
Uh-huh.
So you can already see those leadership skills, that comfort he had in managing a team, even back then.
Right. So after Harvard, he graduated with honors applied mathematics and economics, and then takes a job at Procter & Gamble. He was a product manager there. Seemed like the natural path for someone with his background.
It did.
Yeah.
But clearly, the pull of this new tech world, and maybe more importantly, that connection he had with Gates, it proved too strong to resist.
Yeah.
In 1980, Gates convinces him to come work at Microsoft, their first business manager. And this is a pivotal moment for both of them, for Ballmer and for Microsoft itself.
This is where he starts to really shape the company, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Gates was, without a doubt, the tech genius, the visionary behind all the products. But Ballmer, he brought something totally different to the table, something just as important.
Yep.
He was able to put in place the structures, the actual business practices that took Microsoft from just a group of, really smart programmers to a functional company, a really profitable one at that.
Yeah, so he brought a sense of order, to what was probably a pretty chaotic environment in those days.
Right.
The bio says he did a lot more than just organize, though, right?
Oh, yeah. He was in the thick of it. Strategic planning, finding and recruiting new talent, managing the company's money, all of this while they're growing like crazy throughout the 80s. He was essential in navigating all that.
And then you have that IPO in '86.
Right.
That launched Microsoft and Ballmer to a whole different level.
Oh, yeah.
Went from being the first business manager to a multimillionaire, basically overnight.
That IPO was huge. It cemented his place in the tech world. But I think more importantly, it gave Microsoft the resources and the recognition to go even bigger. This is where you start to see the path towards him becoming CEO, but we need to dig into his leadership style a little bit first. That's a big part of his story. When you think about Steve Ballmer, right, one word that always comes up, I think, is energetic.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. The bio, it definitely doesn't shy away from his, shall we say, unique leadership style.
It's a theme for sure. He was known for these really animated presentations, like really going all out, shouting, jumping around, getting the crowd fired up.
Almost like a preacher or something.
Right. I mean, some people might say he was just, reflecting the excitement around the products, but it was more than that, I think.
I definitely went beyond that, yeah.
He was just so passionate about Microsoft, almost obsessed, and he really wanted everyone else to feel that. Employees, partners, even competitors.
That kind of energy, I mean, it can be contagious, but it can also be a bit much for some. Did the bio mention any downsides to this?
Oh, for sure. There were two sides to it. Some people found it inspiring, motivating, right? Others, they thought it was over the top, even abrasive. There are stories of people being, intimidated by him.
Interesting how one characteristic can be interpreted in such different ways.
Yeah, that's leadership for you. There's no one right answer. What works in one situation might completely backfire in another. With Ballmer, there's no question, that energy, it became his trademark, good and bad.
And so this takes us to the year 2000, another big turning point. Gates steps down as CEO, and Ballmer is the one who takes his place.
Talk about pressure. Gates was basically synonymous with Microsoft at that point. Ballmer wasn't just taking over a company, he was taking over an era.
And it wasn't just about keeping things going as they were either. The tech world was changing fast. What were some of the biggest challenges he had to deal with when he took over?
Oh, it was like a perfect storm. Right.
Yeah.
You've got those new players, Google, Apple gaining more and more influence. Google was changing how people searched for information, and Apple, with the iPod coming out in 2001, they were all about these user-friendly, good-looking devices. Both were direct threats to Microsoft.
Plus, you had that dot-com bubble bursting and then the antitrust issues Microsoft was dealing with. Must have been a crazy time to be in charge of any tech company, let alone one as big as Microsoft.
Exactly, and Ballmer had to deal with all of that while also trying to figure out how to grow Microsoft beyond PC software. PCs were still big, but they weren't the only game in town anymore.
So how did he handle it? Did that intense leadership style work in this new environment?
Well, the bio says he definitely brought that same energy, but he also became more strategic about diversifying what Microsoft offered. He saw that relying just on PCs, that wasn't going to cut it in the long run.
And that's when you see Microsoft really making moves in the business world, right?
Yeah, things like Windows Server, SQL Server, those became huge moneymakers. They were aimed at businesses, not just everyday people. He understood that businesses needed reliable, powerful tech, and he made sure Microsoft was the one to get it to them.
And the bio also talks about how during Ballmer's time, Microsoft launched Azure.
Right.
Cloud computing, I mean, that was barely a thing back then, right?
Yeah.
Looking back, how big of a deal was that?
Launching Azure in 2010, that was huge, really forward-thinking. It's easy to forget now with cloud services everywhere, but back then it was a risk. I don't think even Ballmer knew how much cloud computing would change everything, but he saw the potential.
Yeah.
And because of him, Microsoft was right there from the start.
It seems like he was good at spotting those big trends, setting Microsoft up to take advantage,
Yeah.
even if, they didn't always nail it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And cloud computing, that was just one part of his plan. He also knew how important communication tools were becoming. All that led to them buying Skype in 2011 for, get this, $8.5 billion.
Yeah, everyone was using Skype back then, but it was pretty different from what Microsoft usually did. Was that a mistake, or is he onto something?
It's tough to say, really. I mean, on the one hand, bringing Skype into Microsoft, it made sense. It fit with his idea of making work more connected, more collaborative, something he talked about a lot. But you could argue they didn't do it very well. Skype, even though it was popular, it didn't really mesh with their other products. And some people say they paid way too much for it.
It's funny how even when leaders are successful, trying to make those acquisitions work, it can be really hard. You're trying to bring together different companies, different ways of doing things, different tech.
Totally, and that wasn't even the toughest thing Ballmer had to deal with. Probably the biggest one, the thing that still kind of hangs over his time as CEO, was Microsoft missing out on mobile.
Yeah, when the iPhone and Android came out, that changed everything for everyone.
You really did.
What happened there? Did Ballmer just not see it coming, how fast things would move?
It's more complicated than that. See, Microsoft, with Ballmer in charge, they were actually early to mobile. Windows Mobile, that was a big deal in the early 2000s. Problem was, they didn't get how much people's expectations were going to change.
You mean things like touchscreens, app stores, making everything really easy to use?
Exactly. Microsoft, they were stuck on how things were done on PCs with keyboards and styluses. The iPhone, it looked great, it was super easy to use with a touchscreen, and that caught them off guard. By the time they came out with Windows Phone 7 in 2010, which was better with touch, it was too late. Apple and Google, they were already the big players. Microsoft was just trying to keep up.
The biography says that, at first, Ballmer thought the iPhone was just a niche product, too expensive to be a big deal. That must have been hard to admit he was wrong about that.
Yeah, most people would say that was a big misstep.
So not doing well in mobile, that's a big part of how people judge his time as CEO. How did Ballmer react to all this towards the end of his time at Microsoft?
Even with those setbacks, Ballmer, he was still set on making Microsoft more than just a software company. He knew that wasn't enough anymore. They needed to make hardware too. That's why they came out with the Surface tablet in 2012.
The Surface, they were going right after the iPad with that. Ballsy move, going up against Apple like that.
It was. And those first Surfaces, they got mixed reviews. People said they were too expensive, the software was glitchy, and there weren't enough apps for it. It took a few tries before the Surface started selling well, and really that was after Ballmer had left.
So he was right that Microsoft needed to change, but trying to make hardware, that came with its own problems.
Yeah, but you gotta give him credit. Ballmer pushing for devices and services, that laid the groundwork for what came next under Satya Nadella. Nadella took those ideas and ran with them, made the Surface better, and really grew Azure in the cloud.
It's like leadership's a relay race sometimes. One person gets things started, the next person carries it forward.
Exactly. Ballmer, even with the bumps in the road, he got some important things going. He knew Microsoft had to evolve, and he wasn't afraid to take risks, even if they didn't always work out right away. Microsoft was a very different company when he left, for good and for bad.
And in 2014, after 14 years, Ballmer steps down. But he definitely didn't just disappear. What's he been doing since then?
Oh, Ballmer's been anything but quiet since leaving Microsoft. In 2014, he buys the LA Clippers, the basketball team, for a record $2 billion.
Wow.
Yeah, a lot of people were surprised, but it just kind of made sense, for someone as competitive as him who loves basketball.
And he didn't just buy it to say he owned a team. He's really involved, spending money on the players, the arena, everything.
He brought that same energy from Microsoft to the Clippers, just in a different way. He's always at the games, cheering, talking to fans. He's all in.
And on top of that, he's gotten really into philanthropy, too. He and his wife, Connie, they started the Ballmer Group. They're focused on helping kids and families in the U.S. get ahead financially.
Right. They're trying to create real change, tackling things like poverty, homelessness, and making sure everyone has access to good schools.
Yeah.
They're really into using data, which makes sense given his background, to figure out the best ways to help and to see how much of a difference they're making.
And then there's USA Facts.
Yeah.
That seems like it was made for someone like Ballmer, someone who loves data and wants everything out in the open.
Yeah, USA Facts, it's basically a nonprofit. It gathers all this government data and presents it so that anyone can understand it. His goal is to give people the information they need to have real discussions about how things are run.
It's a cool project. Really speaks to his belief that data can be really powerful if you use it right to get people involved and make positive changes. And he's also been pretty vocal about what he thinks about the future of technology, especially artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
He seems optimistic that AI can help us solve some of the biggest problems we face, but also, warns that it could be risky if we aren't careful about how we develop it. It's a pretty balanced view. You can tell he knows a lot about technology, but also gets the potential downsides.
Definitely.
When you look back at his career, it's clear that Steve Ballmer, he's a complicated guy, super smart businessman, passionate leader, and he wants to make a difference. He did some amazing things, but also made some big mistakes. He was a huge part of building Microsoft into what it is today, but he was also there for some of their most public failures.
I think that's the thing about his story. Leadership, even at the very top, it's messy. You can't predict it. There's no secret formula to get it right every time. The best leaders, they're willing to take chances, adjust when things change, and learn from their mistakes, even when everyone sees them.
It really makes you think. Would things be different now if Ballmer had made different choices? Would Microsoft be the big name in mobile if he had understood what the iPhone would become? Interesting questions, but we'll never know for sure. But one thing's for sure, Steve Ballmer's left his mark on technology, on the world. His story, it's fascinating, inspiring, and it still has people talking.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.